All right. Well, welcome everyone to our virtual colloquium today. I am excited to introduce Dr. Melissa Burt. Melissa is actually, I don't know if you remember this, Melissa. You were actually the very first person I met as an incoming master's student back at Colorado State University. At the time, she was the Education and Diversity Manager at the Center for Multiscale Modeling of Atmospheric Processes, or CMAP, which is at CSU. I had one of the diversity scholarships for my first year as a master's student. So you're the first person I met, and I remember being so surprised by how young you were, because you're not that much older than me. Melissa has a really interesting background. She's been very heavily involved in increasing and retaining historically underrepresented groups. So back then, when I was a grad student at CSU, this was her role at CSU, but not just at the grad level, but also through outreach and CSU's REU program. And not only was she heavily involved with that, but she was also getting her PhD in atmospheric science at the time, researching Arctic climate, which I can't imagine that would be a lot. We all know grad school is busy enough. So after she obtained her PhD in 2016, she became a research scientist, where she focused on the interactions of Arctic clouds, radiation, and sea ice, while at the same time serving as the Education and Diversity Manager for the College of Engineering and the Atmospheric Science Department at CSU. Now, currently, she is the Assistant Dean for Diversity and Inclusion in the Walter Scott Jr. College of Engineering, which is the college where the Atmospheric Science Department lives at CSU. She's the director of the REU program at the Department of Atmospheric Science at CSU. She's also the vice president of the Earth Science Women's Network, and the very first chair of the Culture and Inclusion Cabinet of AMS, which is really exciting. So thank you so much, Melissa, for coming out or for logging in and speaking with us today. I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. I practiced this sharing screen the other day, so here we go. Let's see. And let's see. Okay, Stephanie, can you see my slide here?
Yes, I can.
Okay, because I now can see nobody else. So I'll just.
Yes. I will let you know if anybody pops in a question through either the chat or by raising their hand.
Okay.
I know you can't see that either.
I see nothing except my own screen. So that is wonderful. Okay. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for the introduction. And I'd also like to thank Julia Shates for the invitation to speak as part of your department colloquium here at Wisconsin-Madison. And I do wish that I could be there in person to see all of you there, but I guess today and probably the remainder of this year, Zoom will just have to do. So like Stephanie said, my name is Melissa Burt. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I currently serve as the Assistant Dean for Diversity and Inclusion in our College of Engineering. And that per se will be, from that vantage point, is what I'll be talking with you all today. My title is Cultivating a Culture of Inclusion in the Geosciences Community. And the focus really will think about, or get you all to think about, how can we create a more inclusive and equitable geoscience community, and what are the steps in which we need to take to move forward in that space. So I hope that you all can take some time and to look introspectively, thinking about how you operate, how you engage with one another, and how this really shows up for us in the workplaces that we're in. And then finally, just to think about what are the barriers that may exist in keeping us from being inclusive or equitable in the spaces that we're in. So first, I'd like to just acknowledge, and because I'm not there with you in Wisconsin, I just want to quickly acknowledge the land in which both of our institutions was built upon. So I won't read through this whole paragraph that you see, or 2 paragraphs that you see here on the screen. I just want to ensure and acknowledge with respect that the land that we are using today is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples here in Colorado State University. And this was also a site of trade and gathering and healing for numerous other tribes. When we think about the University of Wisconsin-Madison, it took me a little time to find this land acknowledgement, but the University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Tejope since time immemorial. And so today, University of Wisconsin-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. So I think it's something that's really important as we think about the practices that we do to really acknowledge the places that we are in and the places and the land in which the work that we do scientifically is conducted in. And it goes without saying that this year has been quite challenging. We are still in the midst of a global pandemic that is unveiling the health disparities in this country, along with so many of the inequities that are disproportionately impacting people, in particular people of color. And this pandemic has halted so many different things, if it's the way that we teach our classes, if it's the way that we even show up on our campuses. But it's really made us reevaluate how we do our work, why we do our work, and the methods in which we do that. The other huge, I guess I can say, crisis that has been taking place, that has taken place this year, is really around the racial injustices that have been highlighted, the racial injustices that have been made aware to so many people in this country. And I think it's important that we think about this as we do our work. We think about the lives of people that have been impacted, the struggles that people have had to endure, and how this ultimately affects the ways in which we show up every single day in the work that we do. And what I like to think about this, and this picture is just a mountain view, it's really about the awakening that has taken place this year. For me, I can say personally, and for other people that I know, this year's injustices are not new. This is something that has been around for a long time. And I think it goes without saying how deeply connected folks are feeling with what you're seeing on television or the words that you're hearing being chanted in certain places. And I think it gives us an opportunity to really think about why we do what we do. And now that we have become more awake to the situations that are at hand, even though the media cycles have kind of slowed down in their perceptions or their views of what's been going around us, I think it's important that we still remain, that we still see the sense of urgency that we have in making these things really change. So once you awake, I like to say that you can never go to sleep. And so I think many of you out there are very interested, and I've heard from so many people that they want to know, what can they do? How can they help? How can they learn? How can they grow? And how does this show up for us within the science work that we do? So for us here in the Geosciences, I think it's important that we think about what we can do, how we can better support one another, and how we can really stand for one another. Ultimately, going beyond just the statements that have been made, but to really put action to the words that we speak, and really put us on a journey to be more inclusive, to be more equitable, and really to develop a greater sense of self. Excuse me. So kind of moving forward in my presentation today, I think many of us have kind of seen the headlines that have shown up in major publications. So here is just a quick screenshot that I took from the New York Times that says the Earth Sciences has a whiteness problem. And it really speaks to the fact that we are not as diverse as we may want to be, and this really ultimately impacts the quality of the work that we do. Ultimately, we know that the STEM workforce cannot operate at a full capacity if all available and qualified minds are not engaged. So what are the steps that we're going to do to really change that notion, to change that perception? We've also seen headlines, and this is particularly as we think about professional society meetings and the upcoming meetings that are taking place in the next few weeks. What inequities are at place? This article within Nature Communications speaks to gender inequities in speaking opportunities at the AGU. And so we see this show up in a variety of different spaces that impacts the scientific work that we do. And then if you were to add on the lens of COVID, right, the times of COVID that we're in right now, there's already research showing the disproportionate impacts that COVID is having on on women and the scientific productivity that they have in those spaces. One other headline is really around race and racism in the geosciences. And so I think a lot of people really choose to maybe not purposely or not intentionally look the other way, but sometimes we're really worried about bringing up these conversations around race and racism because we're either scared of being called one thing or another, we're scared of not having the right words to say and not knowing how to interact with each other. But I think it's something that we really need to take ownership of and to take our own self opportunities to learn and grow in these areas and really shift our mindsets in order to better support all people. And then finally, the last headline, and I promise to show you, is this Nature Geoscience commentary article that came out that said no progress on diversity in 40 years. And this article really looks at and makes people reflect on the fact that in terms of racial and ethnic diversity within the geosciences, it is pretty low, right? It speaks to the fact that not many people of color are receiving PhDs in the geosciences, and really what are the steps that we should take as we move forward to really change that goal. So to think about broader impacts initiatives that have been going on for a very, very long time, specifically related to funding from the National Science Foundation, we're not really seeing any growth. We're not really seeing any increases, and really getting us to think about why or what could be causing pretty much so little growth that has. So I'm going to show you here in the next few slides. It may not be surprising at all, but I think it's important that we kind of all start at the same page and to really look at the numbers that are out there. Excuse me. So this figure here shows total PhDs awarded for all races, ethnicity, and genders combined since 1973. So this was 1973 to 2016. And this distinguishes between the earth sciences, the ocean sciences, and the atmospheric sciences. And what we can see here in the figure is that the number of PhDs has pretty much fluctuated around 350 for the earth sciences, but more recently has started to see an upturn in each of the different disciplines over the last decade or so. If we look at the same data with respect to gender, what we notice and what we see here is that the gender gap has narrowed in many of the different disciplines within the earth, the atmosphere, and the ocean sciences. Excuse me, here in the earth sciences, we can see that the gap is pretty narrow. Within the atmospheric sciences, it's not as good. And then when we get to the ocean sciences, we can see that actually women receive more degrees or more PhDs within the ocean sciences in comparison to men. Now, if we were to view this by race and ethnicity with all of the different subfields combined, and this is just because of the small numbers that are out there, we can see that the largest racial group by far, which is shown here in the black line, is the white non-Hispanic group. And probably for most of you, this is not a surprising thing at all. But what I would like for you all to focus on here is when we look at this as it pertains to people receiving PhDs from historically underrepresented groups as it compares to the US population. So the dashed lines are reflections of the US population, and the solid lines are based off of the different underrepresented group. And I should note that this is what NSF considers to be underrepresented. So this is excluding white non-Hispanics and Asian non-Hispanics and comparing that with the increasing share of these groups with the US population. So what we can see if you look at this chart here is that gains in the Hispanic and Latinx PhDs largely reflect the increase that we see in the US population. And ultimately, with respects to any of the other groups, we pretty much don't see any gains in those spaces. And yes, we can look at this and try to decipher what these numbers really, what these numbers actually are. But I think if we look specifically at those cumulative numbers, I think this is what really tells that story that Bernard and Cooper Doc were trying to show in that article. So here we can see a breakdown of each of the different geosciences, more so on the left side of this table, with the cumulative of all geosciences here on the right. And if I highlight the specific groups as it pertains to NSF's definition for historically underrepresented groups, these numbers are actually just pretty alarming. So I just want to give you all the opportunity to kind of see this. And I should note that this is not just the cumulative number for 2016. This is the cumulative number from 1973 to 2016. In particular, looking at the atmospheric sciences, we can see numbers on the order of 95 for Latinx PhDs, 59 for Black PhDs, and 7 for Native American PhDs. So taking this in, it's quite alarming to see the disparities that are taking place as we compare this to the number of PhDs that are received from white non-Hispanic individuals. Then if we move from thinking about PhD attainment to now looking at faculty positions, again, because of the sake of this talk for you all, here I'm showing data from the American Geosciences Institute that looks at the percentage of women in geoscience faculty positions at top four-year institutions. And I can't quite remember the number of institutions that are used in this data, but either way, you get the gist here. So what we know is that women make up around 23% of the geoscience workforce, with 20% of them being faculty. And this varies across the different fields that we see represented within the geosciences, with some disciplines being as low as about 10%, while other disciplines are more closer to that 20% range. And I should note that these gains that we're seeing in representation have mostly been experienced by people who identify as white women. And then from there, if we think about this from the population perspective, who receives bachelor's degrees in the geosciences versus who are our tenure track faculty members, we know that women make up close to 40% of the bachelor's degrees within the Earth, atmosphere, and ocean sciences, but only 20% of them serve as faculty in these fields. Then we look at all women of color, and this includes Black, Latinx, American Indian, Alaska Native, and Asian Pacific Islanders. Women represent about 5% of those degrees and only 7% of the tenure track faculty positions. So you can imagine when we have numbers this low in certain population groups, that this can really lead to detriment effects of kind of their sense of belonging or their feelings of isolation when you are literally one of only a few in a particular department. And this is speaking kind of from a gendered lens, but if you were to look at this as it relates to thinking of faculty members of color or even students of color in many geoscience departments, you can get an idea of how this can have a really big impact on their experiences in those places. And I should note that this is not including any faculty members at minority serving institutions, because we do know that numbers are a bit greater there when you look at the representation of people of color as faculty members in those spaces. So what we can kind of observe from some of these headlines and also some of the articles that I've shared with you today, as Bernard and Cooper Doc indicated, that progress has been nearly stagnant as it pertains to getting people to the PhD levels of the geosciences. And the one thing I will note is I have a difficulty, at least a little bit, saying that there's been like literally no progress, because I feel like that starts to kind of discredit the success of people of color who have matriculated to the PhD levels and are actually sustaining in their careers. So it could be a little bit of semantics, but I think it's also important to acknowledge the fact that there are people who are receiving their PhDs in these fields. We also know that many of the efforts that have taken place, I would say, since the National Science Foundation started requiring broader impacts, have really had impacts or increases in diversity at kind of the grade school level and the undergraduate level, but it hasn't truly translated into the PhD level or at the faculty level. And although these outreach efforts have been really worthwhile and probably have engaged hundreds to thousands of students in these areas, it really isn't sufficient enough to kind of shift our demographics in the ways that we want to see it. And what I think we've really been focusing on, and many of you are probably aware of this idea of a pipeline, the STEM workforce pipeline, is that we spent a lot of money and a lot of efforts funneling people in, if you want to say it like that, into this early engaged method with the hopes that, if we have more people of color or more people from other historically underrepresented groups, that they will retain at some point through these through the pipeline. But we know from a number of reasons that this pipeline approach is really not sufficient. It's also a very passive, and really assumes that there's only one linear pathway into the workforce, into the STEM workforce. And what we can kind of learn from this is that it really doesn't take into consideration the experiences or exclusionary behaviors that folks have to deal with when they go through many of these different spaces. So I think it's really important that we kind of reimagine and retool our thinking as to how do we get people to retain in our STEM disciplines, and really think about this from the experiences in which they are in. So something that I think is really important, I really see value in storytelling. And I wanted to share this quote with you all today from Michelle Obama and from her book called Becoming. And she says, "I'm an ordinary person who found herself on an extraordinary journey. In sharing my story, I hope to help create space for other stories and other voices to widen the pathway for who belongs and why." And something that really resonated with me when I read her book just altogether, but also in reading this quote, is this last notion of who belongs and why. So I think this is something that I think a lot about and I reflect on a lot as to how did I even get to doing what I'm doing right now? Yes, I thought I was always going to be a research scientist and I was going to study certain components of the climate. But did I really know that I was going to be doing things related to, increasing access and diversity and representation and thinking about how we can create more inclusive and equitable spaces? Probably not. So what I want you all to think a little bit about is to consider, have you ever thought about who could be a scientist, or what are reasons in which someone would feel as though they belong? Have you ever thought about a time when you didn't belong, and how did that impact you and the work that you do in those spaces? So just to sit with that for just a few seconds here, and to think about, when was there a moment where you ever felt as though you didn't belong? And maybe not from the lens of like at a party or something like that, but really thinking about this from kind of the scientific perspective or your scientific engagement. Were there ever moments in which you felt as though you didn't belong in those spaces? So I share that because I want to share a little story with you all. And so this is me at 7 years old. And at this time, I was someone who really enjoyed going to the beach. I really liked science experiments. I loved music. I also was someone who was really scared of snakes. I'm not sure why I put that in there today, but that's what it is. Someone who was also scared of tornadoes. And so I should let you know, I grew up in Maryland, just outside of DC and Baltimore. And you would think, why are you so scared of tornadoes, right? Like, tornadoes don't typically happen in this part of the country. So it was a funny little thing for me that really sparked a lot of curiosity for me. So it went from a fear, and I would call the National Weather Service weather line literally every single day in the summer to find out, are we having a tornado? Is there a tornado warning or whatnot? So really taking that fear and sparking the curiosity for me to want to learn more, to want to have a better understanding of meteorology, and really to think about this is actually something that I can do as a career. So I take that younger part of me in the experiences and my thought process to then shifting and going to undergrad. And I was off to college. I was really excited about studying meteorology because I was like, wow, you can actually get paid to do this sort of thing. I was really curious of wanting to understand why a particular phenomenon happened in the way that they did. And really it was a moment that was just super exciting for me, right? Because one, you're also on your own. you have new friends, you're in new experiences, and really you're following the purpose and the passion that you had in life. And so as I started at school, I was doing really well, succeeding, I guess, academically. I had a great group of friends, but there was something that was kind of feeling a little bit off for me. And one day I went to my advisor and I said, I think that this is it for me. Like, I think I should probably quit meteorology. This is not the space for me. I just don't know what I should be doing, and really starting to question a lot of things that were happening for me and showing up for me in the spaces that I was involved in. So she said, if you're going to quit meteorology, what would you actually do? And I was like, I have no idea, right? I probably should have thought about this before I came into your office. I'm not a huge fan of history, so I don't want to do that. And I couldn't think of any other option outside of meteorology. And she said, well, I want you to try one more thing because I think that this will really have an impact on your life, right? So she encouraged me to apply to this program called SOARS, which I'm sure many of you are probably aware of. But SOARS was a program that really focused around that bridge from undergrad to grad and really designed to broaden participation of people from historically underrepresented groups, to provide them with an exposure to research, to help increase their sense of belonging, and to really find them with community. And what I found when I actually got off the plane and landed in Boulder, which first I was like, what is this Boulder place? But that's neither here nor there. But what I really found was that these people who looked like me, who had experiences like me, who came from similar backgrounds to me, we came together as like a tight-knit group, a tight-knit community. And yes, I was super excited about the research that I was doing. But what I really took away from this space was a sense of belonging, a sense of community, and really ultimately it was a transformative experience that really helped me better connect and get re-energized about the scientific work that I was doing. So although at my home institution, I was feeling as though I wasn't completely connecting with everyone, I still had this group of folks who I could reach out to like bounce ideas off or just get them to hear feelings of what I had. So my revelation after this experience was that what I was really feeling, and I think I just never wanted to say out loud, was that I had feelings of isolation. I felt as though I didn't belong in certain spaces. There was a lack of diversity in most of my STEM courses, and there were very little women faculty and absolutely no BIPOC faculty. And I guess I should say BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, or other people of color faculty in the spaces that I was in. And so, at no fault to the institution that I was at, I just think that this is something that was never really discussed, and it was kind of out of the purview of how we engage and we educate individuals in the spaces that we're in. And so what I really got out of this was that, many of us are looking for a particular opportunity, right? We're looking for purpose, we're looking for excitement, we're looking for studying the things that make us, to have successful careers. But what happens to a lot of people, and a lot of people from historically marginalized backgrounds, is that actual experience that they're having is one that is taking a huge toll on their life, right? And the toll on their experiences. So it's not that I wasn't happy with my friends, it's not that I wasn't doing well in school. I just felt as though there were these feelings where people didn't get who I was, and feelings as though I had to hide certain components of who I was in order to be successful in the spaces that I'm in. And so I share this with you because I think it's important to see, and you all know this, right? We all show up in many different ways. We all have very different experiences. But some of the times when you have certain salient identities, when you are one of the only or one of a few, it really can show up and have detrimental effects on the experiences that you have. So I think it's important that we think about this and that we consider this as we do our science, as we educate students, as we interact with our colleagues, to really think about, what are the experiences that we're setting up for everyone around us. And I should say, this is my experience, and it's not meant to speak for all people of color, all Black people, all women in those spaces, but just so we're more informed and we're more aware of the environments that can really cause, people from particular backgrounds some discomfort or some internalized feelings that really impact the experiences that they have. And I should also note, this photo is super dramatic. So I'm not trying to be dramatic in this space, but I think it's really important just to give you that notion of kind of the opportunity versus the experiences that people have. And what we find from this is just like the disproportionate impact that it has on individuals with more than one salient identity. Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a critical race theorist, posed this idea of intersectionality that really speaks to the framework for understanding kind of overlapping dynamics that people have when you have marginalized identities that are at that intersection. And so just showing here a little bit about what some research has shown, that recognizing the influence of multiple identities is really critical for recognizing and understanding complex experiences that people have, that they bring with them, and how they show up in particular spaces. Research also indicates, and this is thinking about accessibility issues, that some areas of the geosciences are more accessible to students than others. If we think about folks who may have hearing impairments versus those who may have visual or cognitive impairments in those spaces. And finally, research has shown that many people of color, in particular Black women scientists and Latinx scientists, are often mistaken for administrative or cleaning staff crew compared to women, either white women or Asian women. And as an example for that, I think back to a few years ago when I was on a panel at the NSF, and I was walking in the hallway in the cafeteria, and someone asked me, if I knew what the cafeteria was offering for lunch that day. And I was thinking to myself, why would somebody ask me that unless they were assuming that that's kind of the roles that I have at this institution, rather than the fact that I'm a successful scientist and I'm here to do a panel review in those spaces. So the other thing that I think is important, and a lot of the work that's come out of Advanced Geo, which is a program around, or a partnership around ways in which we can improve workplace climate conditions, particularly as it relates to exclusionary behaviors like bias and sexual harassment, have really also identified other experiences that people are having, whether you may be gender nonconforming and LGBTQ. They're 3 to 2 times more, they experience 3 to 2 times more exclusionary behaviors than male LGBT+ people. 40% of women of color feel unsafe because of their gender. 27% white women feel that way. And 28% of women of color felt unsafe due to their race. And we even see this showing up in many different professional events or professional society activities that we participate in as well. And then finally, also from Advanced Geo, they also have shown that there are many hostile workplaces and exclusionary experiences within the geosciences that really have impacts on the ways that people operate. Whether if it's 50% of women geoscientists have experienced sexual harassment or have had inappropriate comments or even assault happen to them during field work. We know from kind of university administration staff that 31% of female staff and 19% of male staff have reported experiencing mistreatment. And then there's even higher numbers of people witnessing or experiencing bullying in their workplace at all. So really to bring this to light is that there are many different ways in which that barriers are set up that have impacts on the ways that we do our work and really just truly affect the person that is doing the work that we're trying to do. So what I like to really think about is, we have a social responsibility as scientists, right? There are real problems that are out there, and the things that we've been doing haven't really been working. So I kind of ask the question, when will we step back and apply appropriate science principles to these problems? What are the new approaches that we're going to take to build the scientific workforce that we want to see? Can we even consider the human experience and the emotional piece that people bring into the work that they're doing? Because ultimately, most of the time as physical scientists, and actually work a lot with engineers these days too, we're really socialized. The norm is that we just stick to the science, right? We can just stick to the science, we can do the work that we need to, and we don't need to think about, the other external factors that may be impacting the ways that we show up. But I'd like to say, we're not robots, right? We are humans. We think differently, we do things differently, we develop relationships in a very different way. And it's really important that we consider these pieces so that we can fully show up as our whole selves in the work that we're doing. And ultimately leaning to the fact that we want to create this culture of support, right? It's not always about getting the best students or the best faculty or the best postdoc experience that you want. It's really about creating that environment that's going to be conducive for the success that we need. So I wanted to just bring it to this idea of culture, right? In my title, it was like, how can we create an inclusive and effective and equitable culture? You may not really think about what is actually culture. And I won't read through these bullets, but really, or I won't read all of these bullets, but it really refers to the knowledge, experience, beliefs, and attitudes that we have in the environments that we're in. Fully immersed in culture, literally all the time. We have cultural norms that create us, what is right, what is wrong. We approach a problem this way, or we approach a problem that way. Culture also gets us to think about what's correct versus what is incorrect. But many of these norms and these socialized norms that we see in these spaces are deeply steep in kind of the dominant identities that are in there, that are out there. So as this little graphic shows you here on the left, it says the longer you swim in a culture, the more invisible it becomes. And we can think about many people, if you are a person of color, you have to navigate multiple cultures in their everyday existence and often tend to code switch between one to the other in order to feel as though they are included within the spaces that we're in. So I think it's really important that we consider, a lot of this here at CSU to think about what's the academic culture that we are setting up and how can we ensure that this culture is suitable for all. So I challenge you and get you all to think about, at University of Wisconsin-Madison, in your department of atmospheric and oceanics, what is the culture that you want to be there? And how do you work toward creating the culture that would be useful and equitable and suitable and make a space for everyone to be their best? One thing that I think is really important, kind of continue in this, I guess less of a conversation, but more of me talking to you about this, is that language really matters. And I think it's really important that we think about when we say the words, if you're used to DEI, what do you mean by DEI? Or if you're used to the terminology here that I have, JEDI, which I think maybe many scientists would actually like, what do we mean by justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion? Because we can say that we care about these things. We can say that we commit to doing these, but what are really the actions that we are going to take to think about each of these individual letters and what do they mean in those spaces? Because they all mean different things, and we ultimately can't have the environment that we want if we don't think about how each of these components impacts one another in order to ultimately get to what we like to say as social justice in those spaces. So my question that I like to pose is, have you really thought about what stops us from being inclusive and equal in our academic departments or in the geoscience community? How do we as institutions move towards actualizing our commitment to be equitable, to be inclusive, to be anti-racist? How can we implement into practice in response to maybe concerns or experiences that students, faculty, and staff are having? How can we do that? And I think the other notion, I was thinking a little bit about this morning, is that it's kind of historic and uncharted territory right now, right? It's the unique confluence of COVID and the movement for Black lives. And now it's really imperative for us to strategically transform our institutions, to be authentic in the work that we say that we're going to do, to be transparent in the work that we say that we're going to do, and ultimately to be courageous. A lot of people don't want to kind of break down those barriers as they're worried about, how it's going to impact my career. Or you don't want to be the person who's too loud and wanting to vouch for a particular thing because it'll affect your tenure, as an example. But I think it's important that we lead with courage, and we also lead with empathy, because ultimately we are people doing the work doing, and empathy is something that really should resonate in most of us. And we have an opportunity and the means to ensure that equity, social justice, are pillars that guide and characterize the work that we do. specifically as it leads to future generations of people within the different workspaces that we're in. So I really like to think about this as I tackle these problems. And again, there's no perfect way to do any of these activities, but to really think about this from three distinct areas. What is the individual change that we're going to make? How are we becoming more aware? How are we becoming more competent? And what are the individual skill sets that we want to develop in these spaces? When we think about this from kind of an organizational perspective or your academic perspective, what is the culture and the climate that we want to see? Not that just we aspire to see, but what are the actions that we'll put forth to make it the way that we want it to be? And then what are the systemic policies, structures, physical spaces that kind of get in the way for efforts to truly increase in these areas? So the way that I framed a lot of the work that I do here at CSU, and would encourage you all to think about this as well, is how can you incorporate JEDI foundation to STEM? Right? If it's a priority, it has to show up as a core component in all of our activities. It must show up in our teaching, in our research, in our service, in our engagement. We have to actually held accountable to make this show up in each of these different spaces. And to fully integrate this into the workplace culture, into our department culture, it has to be a community effort. Right? It can't just be, people in positions like me, or it can't just be, the two faculty members of color who really want to make a difference, or the two women faculty members who really want to make things change. We all have to take our own responsibilities to make the changes that we want to see. And because of this, we're all showing up in a variety of different ways, right? So training is something that's really valuable to all populations. And as departments, as faculty, as higher up in the administration chain of an institution, we have to ensure that we meet individuals where they are in order for them to kind of fully take in and take advantage of the opportunities that are available to them. And ultimately, meaning it really allows us to practice the things that we need to do. So now I'm going to move into just some recommendations that I think could be useful for folks here. When we think about this at the individual level, one simple thing that you can do is do some self-reflection, right? If we can kind of disrupt our own behaviors and think about how we're treating one another, if we're people with respect, I think that's something that really helps. I think it's to also take some time to increase your own awareness and knowledge of cultural competencies. One thing that people try to automatically jump to is to jump to the skills and actions. And I should say this is a multicultural model that really focuses on how can we be more truly aware. So it starts with awareness, then it goes to knowledge, skills, and actions. And people really want to jump to these skills and actions place without taking the time to develop oneself awareness and also the knowledge that is necessary to inform our actions. So beyond just self-reflection, I think it's important that we make personal connections, that we start a conversation, and that we take accountability. And what I've found is that as people begin to talk with one another, and language can be a barrier in those spaces, many biases and many prejudice components that come out can be overcome by making conversation or making personal connections with one another. When we think about those of us that are practitioners in the classroom, how can we really foster a very supportive space in the classroom? If you're a TA, if you're a faculty member, if you're an instructor, how can you really cultivate a learning environment where you can ensure that your students are treated equitably, have equal access to learning, and feel valued and supported in their learning? And I think that this is something that's really important that also helps to kind of start the conversation and to get people to kind of meet each other where they are. And so I work a lot with our faculty on this particular thing to think about, who are they as instructors? Who are the students that they're teaching? What is the actual content and curriculum that they're teaching? And how do we really work to being more inclusive and equitable in our pedagogy and our practice in those spaces? So recommendations that I have for academic departments, and I don't think much of this is that novel at all, but I think it's something that can get you all thinking a bit about it, is that it's important to perform kind of regular cultural surveys and use their outcomes to inform inclusiveness and equity. it's imperative to develop robust and meaningful diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plans, and to not just do this process and then put a book of a plan on a shelf, but really to think about, what is your strategy? What are the metrics? How are you going to hold yourselves accountable to do those things? I think it's important that we implement meaningful mentoring and retention programs, which can be available to all community members, along with adequate resources that help to get those processes going. And also to commit, and not just to commit to hiring, promoting, and supporting people of color or LGBTQ people or people with disabilities, but to really follow through. So you can commit as much as you want, but if you're not held accountable to making that commitment actually happen, then it's kind of a moot space at that point. And so I think it's important, especially as we develop these mentoring plans or mentoring programs, retention programs, commit to hiring and promoting and supporting people, that we also listen to people's voices, that we acknowledge and help eliminate the barriers that people may face, and to really truly support the efforts in which they have. Other important things that we can consider and that we should do is really to challenge and eliminate policies that can be exclusionary. The GRE or normative grading are examples of those sort of things. To really require that everyone think about inclusive and policies and practices. And finally, I think this is a big one, and I think this is where things will really change, is to review and redefine the tenure and promotion policies and practices to not just support them, but to support and reward teaching, mentoring, and service, because a lot of people are doing a lot of labor, right? And it takes work to develop relationships, to create more inclusive cultures, and to really build community. So I think it's important that we do really consider how we can have an impact in some of these policies. I'll skip over that. Recommendations that I have for students, advocate for what you need for success. And I don't think that you all should be afraid to share your experiences. And of course, share your experiences with people that you trust. Really think about ways in which you can develop the trust, if it's within your research group, your research lab, whatever it may be. And ultimately to be the change that you want to see. So I encourage you all to lead by example. And even as students, you can lead other students, you can lead undergraduate mentees or trainees. You don't have to be a faculty member to really put forth the change that you want to see. And I think it's important that you hold your departments accountable for what they say, followed by what they actually do. As we think about faculty, of course, you all should also consider leading by example. I encourage many people to review their course material to ensure that you are including scholarly work and contributions from people outside of the dominant identities, and to think about how this relates to issues of race, inclusion, equity, and social justice in the classroom. Leverage the tenure that you may have to strongly advocate for institutional investment in diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, and really to facilitate critical dialogues on how your department processes certain practices, and really invite and elevate input from those who voices are not typically heard in those spaces. Just a few more things, kind of as lab leaders or lab groups or research group leaders, really set the stage by identifying mechanisms that will really help individuals within your group spaces be successful. Asking questions like, what do you need to do your best work? What accessibility or accommodations may you need? How would you like to be advised? How do you thrive the most in these types of settings? And really, what would you like your workspace to be like? Also encourage developing and cultivating and nurturing the community within your spaces, and to use this as a foundation. Trust is something that is earned, and I think it's important that within research groups that you trust the people that you're around in order to have a very safe environment for all people. So it can be difficult to engage in these sort of conversations because, one, you're making yourself rather vulnerable, but I think it really speaks to the foundation that makes for a very great team, because then you can utilize all the various talents and efforts that each member brings to the table. And finally, I think it's important that we engage in critical conversations regularly. What I've heard a lot from students is that they feel as though within the geosciences or in STEM classes that we don't address the issues that are happening in the world. So it's almost like we're turning a blind eye to what's really happening because we're just sticking again to that science work that we're doing. So it may be difficult for you to engage in those critical conversations, but I think the more that we take time and we practice in doing this, I think the better ultimately it will be for everyone else. And so here's an idea that I've been thinking a lot about, and it's really the idea of mattering versus marginality. So I encourage you all to think about, how do we ensure that people within our spaces or within our spheres of influence know that they matter in those situations, which ultimately results in more retention, more success, and productivity, versus thinking about it from a marginality perspective, where people feel as though their feelings are ignored, or they're separated, or they're kind of on the outskirts of what's actually happening. Because this marginality perspective really tends to decrease morale, also makes people feel less invested, and ultimately could result in a departure in the spaces that they're in. So one final, I don't want to call this a plug, but I think it's important that we're aware of the variety of different calls to actions that have been out there these last few months. Many of you have probably seen that there were 2 different calls to actions for how we can create a more anti-racist scientific community within the geosciences. This bottom one was a change.org one that was led by Hendrada Ali out of Fort Hays State. And then this one here at the top, which has been deemed, I guess, No Time for Silence, which was led by Vernon Morris and others. And I was also a co-author of this one, to really get people to listen and act to dismantle structures that perpetuate injustices and systemic racism out there. And within both of these calls, including proposed actionable strategies for things that we can do from the professional society level all the way down to the academic department. And I know that many of you may have signed on to these calls to action, but my question then is to think about, what have you done? You've signed on to those actions. So really get your mind thinking, to think about where you can go, what you can do, and how you can impact the sphere or the network of people around you to make, the geosciences more inclusive, also more inclusive. So my final challenge to you all is just to think about these next few questions. Think about your sphere of influence and where you can be a better advocate or a better ally, and to amplify the voices of those who may not always have a seat at the table. So as we think about this in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, what can I shift in my work as an individual? What can I shift in my work if I'm on a committee? How can I change the way we do things as a research group, a department? And finally, where can I influence my university to be more inclusive, to be more equitable, and to be anti-racist? So I share all of this because I think we're all at different points. We all have different networks that we can influence, but I think we all have individual commitments to really want to do this work, and it takes time. But I think it's important that we really take a step back, we take a deep look in, and think about how we can have a role in collectively making the change that we want to see. And I know I said final a bunch of times, but I'll say, if you haven't had the chance to vote yet, I hope that you get out there and you vote for this last day that we have, or last 2 days that we have. So with that, I'd just like to thank you all for your attention. And I think we have time for questions, I'm not sure.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. We do have some time for questions. So we will first begin with students. If any students have any questions, please raise your hand, or you're welcome to also type it into the chat.
I feel like I'm losing my voice now, so sorry.
Yes, we have a question. Go ahead, Nikan.
Hi. Thank you, Melissa, for the great talk. I really enjoyed it. I just had a question about, do you have any book recommendations to delve in further on the topic? Like, is there anything you've read in particular that kind of helps you, look at these in a different way, or kind of delve into the information more?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's particularly what topic are you interested in, and what kind of is the lens that you're coming from. I'll say, what I read recently, and it's because I've been facilitating conversations within some of our classes is around kind of how to be an anti-racist. And really this book, if you haven't read it yet, really speaks to there's no middle ground, right? You're either this or you're that. And anything that we do to not to fully act in one way, or hopefully acting in the anti-racist way, it is something that can truly have long-term impacts on people. So really thinking about how can we put forth actionable steps, and also take a look in to see, you know, what have we been thinking about in those spaces. I know other people, and I haven't per se read this book because I don't think it really speaks to me, but people have found the White Fragility book to be a very useful book for individuals to read. I do have a list of other resources, and for some reason I can't like top of my head right now, but I'm happy to also share, especially as we think about this within like the science context, I think would be really important. So thank you for your question.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
I was muted. Okay. So we have a question in the chat. So Karen says, great talk. Did your early slides that had earth science as one category versus Atmos and ocean, did earth science include physical geography in those plots? You know?
I don't think so. But I'm not 100% on that.
Okay. Zoe, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I was curious, thinking about the context of COVID and everything's virtual right now. I know a lot of instructors are trying to cope with that, just teaching virtually online, and that leads to even more separation of feeling inclusive or being part of a class. Do you have any recommendations for professors or TAs teaching classes of how to still make those spaces intentionally inclusive and give a sense of belonging?
Yeah, one thing that I've found to be useful, especially as we move to these virtual settings, is to set up kind of co-created expectations that we have of each other, and really spending time as a class, and of course this depends on how large your class is, but really spending time as a class to think about how is it that we want to engage with one another, knowing the situation that we're in right now, knowing that we're in these virtual spaces and there's so many different external things that could be happening to us in those spaces. So I think even just leaving time to talk about a particular topic, I think is something that has been useful. And when I've been going into a lot of classes as a guest lecture person, I've really been giving students the opportunities to take moments to self-reflect and to think. And in that self-reflection process and applying that to a particular, you know, question that we may have, I think that helps us get a better understanding of who each other may be. And also being honest in the struggles that we may be having on the day-to-day life of what we're going through right now. Because it's not just, you know, the students are kind of shifting and having to deal with this. You know, as faculty, we're also kind of shifting and trying to evolve. And I think we can get so caught up in just sticking to what we have to do and what we're supposed to get through that we don't leave room for flexibility and engagement in the same space.
Brad, you can go ahead.
Thanks. Melissa, thanks for sharing your experience and your expertise. It was really timely because this is kind of, as you said, an awakening for a lot of people. You talked about the leaky pipe and how, as I understood, you said that engagement and recruitment up to K through 12 was working, but then retention and sustaining didn't. What do you see? You talked about alternative ways to get into that other than the engagement and recruitment. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Where did things fall apart?
Okay, sorry to interrupt you there. At least in my opinion, when I've thought about this pipeline perspective, is that people have thought we just engage engage, and then recruit people into a space, and they'll automatically see where they are and they see themselves in those spaces. And I think what we haven't focused so much on are how do we keep people in the spaces and present the work that we do in a way that is meaningful to people from all backgrounds, right? I think it's also the thought that, you know, the more, let's just say, you could do it as a numbers thing, the more people that come into the pipeline, you hope that enough people, that the attrition rates will be much smaller, right? That if we can fill the pipe in the beginning with a lot of people, that ultimately there will be some people who stick around and stay. So I just think we have to be more intentional in our practices of when we think about people at the variety of different levels that they're in. How are we ensuring that we are taking into consideration, you know, where people may be at or the experiences that they may be having, if it's, you know, in undergrad or grad school or wherever it may be. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but I think it's just redefining or reimagining how people end up in the workforce, rather than thinking of it just as a straight line, which we know is not true.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions for Melissa? Go ahead, Dan.
Hi, Melissa. Thank you so much for that talk. Your personal stories there and the experience with SOARS was very a very powerful story. I appreciate that very much, and I've heard such great things about that. One of the to I guess reiterate on some of Zoe's question in teaching these. One of the ways we recruit people into our major here in AOS is through our large lecture courses. And I'm wondering if you have suggestions of techniques. I was interested in, you had mentioned that you work with a lot of people in developing in their courses and developing ways to try and be more inclusive in their teaching. I wonder if you have some suggestions there.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. So what's hard is sometimes in these large classes, right, that the personal connection just can't be there. Or it just is not as easy to be there, I'll say it like that. But I guess what I'll say here is that the more that we can get to know people and how we can see that, like as a faculty member, that you know who your students are and that you know your students' names and that you have found particular things that are of interest to those individual people, that it really is helpful. So as an example, one thing that I've done in one of the lecture classes that I go in on a regular case, there's like maybe like 150 students in this class. And what we did on the first day of the class was like pass around virtually a note card. This is what I would have done in the real class, but pass around a note card and just have the students write down kind of their name, you know, their pronouns if they choose to use them. And one thing that is that like I like to do and one thing that they like to do, right? So if we can take the time to share who we are and what are particular things that resonate with students in our classrooms, then I think that they have a better understanding of how they can show up and how they can talk with us. So I think it's just, what are the ways in which you can make personal connections with your students? Like I literally am like studying these cards so I can remember who each of these students are, like as they pop up in like the breakout room or whatever I'm doing on Zoom, right? So I think it's all about just ways in which you can make personal connections. Another really fun thing that you could do, some of the classes I have started them with just playing music over Zoom. If I arrive just a few minutes early, play music over Zoom and welcome students to share with me, hey, you know, here's a song that you would like to hear at the start of our class. So just even bringing in things that they like, it's just a passive method of doing it, right? But it's at least getting them excited about something and giving them the opportunity to have ownership of something that we're going to do in the class on this. So if they send me an email beforehand, it's like, I really would love for you to play, I don't know, X song, as long as it's appropriate. There have been a couple things that are not appropriate at all. But as long as it's appropriate, that you could at least play that in the classroom and they feel some sort of connection in that way. I've seen, someone shared with me the other day, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet, just ways in which you can community build in the community build just in general with your classes over Zoom or whatever. What is this, Blackboard? This is Blackboard? Whatever we're using right now, but over the various platforms, right? Like, so just coming up with like either icebreaker activities or some way that you can just make that connection and just have like a little fun moment outside of the particular course content that you have to share.
Thanks. That's it. I love the idea of music. There are
As
these.
long as it's appropriate, I will just.
That's great. I'd love to talk with you about this a little more. There's some. Those are some great suggestions. Thanks.
Sure, and I probably have more, but you know, sometimes you just can't. I can't think off the top of my head right now.
Sure, I've been putting you on the spot here. Thanks.
Okay, so we'll make this the last question since we're out of time. So in the chat we have a question from Erica. Can you speak to what AMS is working on with regards to JEDI?
Thank you. Thanks, Erica, for the question. So the AMS is, like all professional society, is trying to think about, you know, how can we really move forward and make our community not just more diverse, but also how we can be more inclusive in the ways in which we're doing things. And so the AMS, as Stephanie indicated in my introduction here, the AMS just established a new kind of level of the organizational chart that's called the Culture and Inclusion Cabinet. And this cabinet is really focused around providing kind of high-level recommendations as to how we can be more inclusive, to really garner a sense of belonging across the society and also the profession, in ways in which we can assess the culture of the AMS. So historically, much of the work as it's related to diversity, equity, and inclusion has fallen within one particular board to kind of be representative of the whole society. But of course, one board can't do everything, right? And so how can we be more intentional of thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in every single component of the AMS, from the technical side of things to our communication to how we operate as a society in those capacities. So this cabinet is just starting, and we have a lot of work to do. We're also working on ways in which we can even diversify just the staff of the American Meteorological Society, right? Like, many of the people that have worked for AMS have been at AMS for, you know, decades, and a lot of things have changed in the last few decades, right? And so how can we truly kind of have a holistic approach as to how we think about culture, how we think about who's included, and how do we ensure that our society kind of speaks to the community that we have out there. That's just one example, Erica. But other things are also working with partner organizations like the AGU and other professional societies to not just get the message out there, but to develop, you know, diversity strategic plan for the AMS. How do we incorporate that into the research and serving society missions of the society as well?
Great, thank you so much.
Thanks, Erica.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa, for your wonderful presentation. We will stop here, but that was wonderful, and we really appreciate you speaking on such an important subject. So thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for being here, and I look forward to, I guess I have a bunch of people that I'm meeting with tomorrow, so I look forward to engaging in that way as well. Thank you.